Before it was called New York City, this place was something else entirely. No skyscrapers, no traffic, no glowing skyline. Instead, there were forests so dense sunlight barely touched the ground, rivers that moved freely without concrete walls, and shorelines alive with fish, birds, and quiet movement. The island we now call Manhattan was not a destination, it was a living landscape. And for thousands of years it belonged to people who understood it not as property, but as home. Those people were the Lenape Native Americans. They lived across what is now New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. To them, Manhattan was called Mannahatta, which roughly meant the island of many hills. It was rich land, fertile soil, fresh water, and abundant wildlife. The Lenape hunted deer, fished the rivers, gathered shellfish, and farmed corn, beans, and squash. Life here followed the rhythm of seasons, not clocks. There were no borders drawn on maps. The land was shared, respected, and passed down through generations as a responsibility, not an asset. What made this place special, even before cities, was geography. Manhattan sat at the mouth of a vast natural harbor, protected and deep enough for ships. Rivers connected it to the interior of the continent. If you were standing here centuries ago, you wouldn't see destiny, but you would feel opportunity. This land was a crossroads. Long before global trade, it was already a meeting point for peoples, cultures, and movement. That advantage would quietly shape everything that followed. But history rarely asked permission. When European explorers arrived in the early 1600s, they did not see a homeland. They saw potential. They saw timber, fur, trade routes, control. The Lenape had no concept of owning land the way Europeans did. Agreements were misunderstood, ignored, or exploited. Within decades, disease, displacement, and violence would devastate the native population. A world that had existed for thousands of years would vanish in a single generation, and in its place, something entirely new would begin to rise, slowly, uncertainly, on the foundations of a forgotten island. When the first Europeans began settling the island in the early 1600s, they were not dreamers looking to build a great city. They were merchants, traders, investors. The people who would shape the next chapter of Manhattan were the Dutch, and they arrived with a very specific purpose. To them, this place was not sacred land or future skyline. It was a business opportunity. In 1624, the Dutch West India Company established a small trading post on the southern tip of the island, naming it New Amsterdam. From the beginning, profit mattered more than permanence. The Dutch West India Company was not a government in the traditional sense. It was a corporation, backed by investors, operating with military power. Its mission was to control trade routes, especially the lucrative fur trade. Beavers, in particular, were valuable in Europe, where felt hats were in high demand. Manhattan's location made it perfect for this business. Ships could dock easily in its deep harbor, and the Hudson River allowed traders to reach far inland. New Amsterdam quickly became a gateway between Europe and North America, not because it was beautiful, but because it was useful. One of the most famous and misunderstood moments in New York's history happened during this period. In 1626, the Dutch governor Peter Minuit negotiated an agreement with local Lenape people, often simplified as buying Manhattan for $24. In reality, this was not a purchase as we understand it today. The Lenape likely believed they were agreeing to shared land use, not permanent ownership. The Dutch believed they had secured control. This misunderstanding reflects a deeper clash of worldviews, one that would repeat itself across the continent. The transaction became a symbol not of clever bargaining, but of how easily cultures talked past one another. Despite its growing importance, New Amsterdam was rough around the edges. It was small, muddy, and chaotic. Streets were unpaved, buildings were wooden, laws were loosely enforced. Unlike later English colonies, the Dutch were relatively tolerant.
The settlement included people from many backgrounds: Dutch, Germans, Scandinavians, Africans, both free and enslaved, Jews, and others. This early diversity was not born from idealism, but practicality. The Dutch needed workers and traders. They allowed difference because it made business easier, and without realizing it, they planted one of the most enduring traits of the future city: diversity as a strength.
By the middle of the 1600s, New Amsterdam was no longer just a trading post. It was a functioning town, modest but valuable, sitting in one of the best natural harbors in the world. And that made it a target. At this time, Europe was dominated by powerful empires, constantly competing for land, wealth, and influence. The Dutch were excellent traders, but they were not always prepared to defend what they built. In 1664, English warships quietly entered the harbor. There was no great battle, no dramatic siege. The Dutch, outmatched and unsupported, surrendered the city without firing a shot. Just like that, New Amsterdam became English, and its name was changed to New York City. The city was renamed in honor of the Duke of York, who would later become King James II of England. With this transfer of power came new laws, new rulers, and a new identity. But interestingly, the English did not erase everything the Dutch had built. The street layout, the trading mindset, and the multicultural population remained. Even today, traces of Dutch influence survive in place names, street patterns, and the city's enduring emphasis on commerce. What changed most was not the people, but the ambition. Under English control, New York began to think of itself not just as a port, but as a growing center of power. As the 1700s unfolded, New York grew steadily. Its population expanded, its economy diversified. Ships carrying goods, enslaved people, and raw materials passed through its docks daily. The city became deeply connected to the British Empire's global trade network. But prosperity came at a cost. Slavery was legal and widespread in colonial New York. By the early 1700s, nearly 1 in 5 residents of the city was enslaved. This is an uncomfortable but essential part of the city's history. New York's growth was built not only on trade and opportunity, but also on exploitation. By the time tensions between the American colonies and Britain began rising in the mid-1700s, New York found itself in a complicated position. It was economically tied to Britain, yet increasingly influenced by revolutionary ideas. Merchants worried about disruption, workers demanded rights, loyalists and rebels lived side by side. When the American Revolution finally erupted, New York became a strategic prize, occupied by British forces for much of the war. The city was divided, damaged, and uncertain about its future. But when independence finally came, New York would emerge not as a defeated outpost, but as a city ready to redefine itself once again. When the American Revolutionary War finally ended, New York City was exhausted. Years of British occupation had left parts of the city damaged, its economy disrupted, and its people divided. Fires had destroyed neighborhoods, trade had slowed. Many loyalists had fled, while others stayed behind quietly, unsure of their place in the new nation. And yet, beneath that uncertainty, something important was happening. For the first time, New York was no longer a colony serving a distant empire. It was part of a new experiment, a country trying to define itself. And this city, battered but ambitious, was about to play a central role in that story. In fact, for a brief but meaningful moment, New York became the capital of the United States. From 1785 to 1790, the city served as the nation's political center. George Washington was inaugurated as the first president on the balcony of Federal Hall, right on Wall Street. Congress met here. Laws were written here. The foundations of American government took shape here. Though the capital would later move to Philadelphia and then Washington, D.C.,
New York never forgot this early taste of national importance. It gave the city confidence, a sense that it belonged at the center of power. As the 1800s began, New York started to grow in a new direction. Commerce returned, stronger than before. Shipping, finance, and manufacturing expanded rapidly. The city's grid system was introduced, laying out streets and avenues in a strict, rational pattern that stretched far beyond the old colonial core. This decision shaped the future skyline in ways few could imagine at the time. The city was no longer growing organically, it was being planned for scale. New York was preparing itself not just for growth, but for dominance. But growth brought tension. Wealth accumulated quickly for some, while others struggled in overcrowded neighborhoods. Disease spread easily. Sanitation was poor. Infrastructure struggled to keep pace with population. Still, people kept coming. Farmers, craftsmen, laborers, and entrepreneurs were drawn by opportunity. New York was becoming something new, not just a city of trade, but a city of ambition. It was loud, uneven, uncomfortable, and full of promise. The foundations of the modern metropolis were being laid, brick by brick.
Look at the size of it.
They say it's the city of dreams.
I hope so.
By the middle of the 19th century, New York City began to change faster than ever before. The city was no longer defined only by trade or politics. It was becoming defined by people. Millions of them. Ships arrived daily, carrying men, women, and children who had crossed the Atlantic not for adventure, but for survival. Some fled famine, others escaped war, religious persecution, or crushing poverty. For many, New York was not the final destination. It was the first test. The city did not welcome them gently, but it offered something powerful: possibility. Ellis Island became the symbolic gateway to America. Between 1892 and 1954, more than 12 million immigrants passed through its halls. They arrived tired, frightened, hopeful, and uncertain. Doctors examined them quickly. Officials asked questions they barely understood. A wrong answer could mean being sent back. For those allowed to stay, the Statue of Liberty stood nearby, a quiet promise of freedom, even if reality would be far harsher. Most immigrants arrived with little more than a suitcase and a name they hoped would survive pronunciation. These newcomers did not blend instantly. Instead, they built neighborhoods that felt familiar. Irish communities formed in Lower Manhattan. Italians clustered in what became Little Italy. Jewish immigrants settled in crowded tenements on the Lower East Side. Chinese immigrants built Chinatown despite discrimination and exclusion laws. These neighborhoods were crowded, noisy, and often unhealthy. Entire families lived in single rooms. Work was dangerous and poorly paid. Child labor was common. Yet even in these conditions, culture thrived. Languages, food, music, faith, and traditions filled the streets. New York became a living mosaic. What made this moment extraordinary was scale. No city in the world absorbed people like New York did. The population exploded. Streets overflowed. New problems emerged: housing shortages, labor unrest, public health crises. But alongside struggle came energy. Immigrants built the subways, factories, bridges, and skyscrapers that would define the city. They powered its economy and reshaped its identity. New York was no longer just a city in America. It was becoming a city of the world, imperfect, overwhelming, and alive with human ambition.
By the middle of the 20th century, New York City stood at the height of its global influence. It was wealthy, powerful, and culturally dominant. But beneath the surface, deep problems were forming. Manufacturing jobs began to disappear as factories moved elsewhere. Middle-class families left the city for the suburbs. Tax revenues fell, while public costs continued to rise. Slowly, quietly,
the systems that had supported the city for decades began to weaken. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, New York was facing a crisis unlike anything in its history. The city's finances collapsed. In 1975, New York City came dangerously close to bankruptcy. It could not pay its bills. Public services were cut dramatically. Fire stations closed. Garbage piled up. Subway cars were covered in graffiti and often broke down mid-route. Crime rates surged. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned or burned, sometimes deliberately, as landlords found insurance payouts more profitable than maintaining properties. Fear became part of daily life. The phrase "Fear City" appeared on pamphlets warning visitors of a city spiraling out of control. This crisis was not only economic, it was psychological. New Yorkers lost confidence in their city. News reports portrayed New York as dangerous, dirty, and dying. Businesses fled. Tourism declined. People who stayed learned to adapt. Communities relied on one another. Artists moved into cheap, abandoned spaces, unintentionally laying the groundwork for future cultural revival. Even in its darkest moments, the city did not stop producing music, art, and ideas. Creativity often thrives where resources are scarce. What ultimately saved New York was not a single policy or leader, but a slow, painful rebuilding process. Financial reforms stabilized budgets. Crime eventually declined. Neighborhoods began to recover, though not evenly. The city learned hard lessons about neglect, inequality, and resilience. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, New York was no longer collapsing, but it carried scars. Those scars shaped a tougher, more cautious city, one that understood it was not invincible, and one that would never forget how close it came to losing.
We need to
On the morning of
evacuate now!
September
Roger
11,
that!
2001, New York City
Watch for
began the
falling
day
debris!
like any other. Commuters filled subways. Offices opened. Coffee cups steamed on street corners. The skyline stood familiar and steady, crowned by the twin towers of the World Trade Center, symbols of the city's financial power and global reach. And then, within hours, that sense of normalcy vanished. The attacks that followed were not just an assault on buildings, but on the feeling of safety that millions of people carried with them. For New York, this was not simply a tragedy, it was a turning point. In the immediate aftermath, the city moved into shock. Streets fell silent. Smoke filled the air. Entire neighborhoods were evacuated. People searched desperately for loved ones, staring at bulletin boards filled with photographs and handwritten notes. First responders ran toward danger without hesitation, many of them never returning. The scale of loss was overwhelming, yet the response revealed something deeply human. Strangers helped one another. Volunteers arrived in waves. New York, bruised and grieving, refused to collapse inward. In the weeks and months that followed, the city changed psychologically. Security became visible everywhere. Daily routines were altered. A sense of vulnerability lingered beneath ordinary life. Yet alongside fear, there was resolve. The phrase, "never forget," appeared across the city, not as a slogan, but as a collective promise. Memorials took shape. Families mourned. The skyline itself was altered permanently, leaving an absence that felt as meaningful as any structure. Over time, rebuilding began, slowly, carefully, and with debate. What should rise where the towers once stood? How could the city honor the dead while continuing to live? The answer was not simple. But as one World Trade Center eventually rose, taller than before, it carried symbolism beyond architecture. It represented endurance. New York did not erase its pain, it carried it forward. And in doing so, the city reaffirmed something it had proven again and again throughout history. It could be wounded deeply, but it would not be defined by destruction.
As the 21st century progressed, New York City entered yet another phase of reinvention. The city recovered from crisis and tragedy and reasserted itself as a global center of finance, culture, and influence. Glass towers replaced abandoned lots. Neighborhoods once considered unsafe became desirable. Technology firms joined banks and media companies as major forces shaping the economy. New York's image shifted again, this time toward innovation, creativity, and global connectivity. Yet beneath this success, new tensions quietly emerged. One of the most defining forces of modern New York has been gentrification. As investment flowed into long-neglected neighborhoods, rents rose sharply. Longtime residents, often working-class families and communities of color, found themselves priced out of the places they had called home for generations. Coffee shops replaced corner stores. Luxury apartments replaced old walk-ups. To some, this change represented progress and safety. To others, it felt like erasure. The city grew cleaner and wealthier in many areas, but also more unequal. Opportunity expanded, but not evenly. At the same time, New York's influence continued to stretch far beyond its borders. Decisions made in financial districts affected global markets. Media produced here shaped conversations worldwide. Fashion, music, art, and politics flowed outward from the city in waves. New York became not just a place where things happened, but a place that helped decide what mattered. This power brought prestige and responsibility. The city's struggles with housing, policing, inequality, and infrastructure became symbols of challenges faced by modern urban life everywhere. Then came new tests: economic downturns, political division, and a global pandemic that once again emptied streets and forced New Yorkers indoors. The city that had survived fires, wars, collapse, and terror faced isolation and uncertainty. Yet history repeated itself. Slowly, life returned. Restaurants reopened. Subways filled again. People adapted. New York did not become weaker, it became more aware of its fragility, and perhaps more conscious of the balance it must strike between growth and humanity as it moves forward.
When you step back and look at New York City as a whole, something becomes clear. This is not a city defined by one moment, one culture, or one era. It is a city that has been rebuilt again and again, sometimes by choice, sometimes by necessity. From a forested island shaped by the Lenape people, to a Dutch trading post, to a British colony, to the birthplace of American ambition, New York has never stood still for long. Change is not an interruption to its story. Change is the story. What truly defines New York is not its skyline or its wealth, but its ability to absorb people, ideas, and shocks, and still move forward. Every generation arrives believing it is facing unprecedented challenges, and in many ways it is right. Yet the city adapts, it learns, it reshapes itself. Immigrants once crowded into tenements now have descendants building businesses, art, and institutions. Neighborhoods rise, fall, and rise again. Even loss becomes part of the city's memory, carried quietly alongside hope. New York matters because it reflects something deeply human. It shows what happens when millions of different lives are layered on top of one another, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in conflict. It is a place where ambition is celebrated, but also questioned, where success is visible, but so are its costs. The city does not pretend to be perfect. It exposes inequality, struggle, and tension in plain sight, and in doing so, it forces conversations that other places often avoid. Today, New York remains a symbol, not of perfection, but of possibility. People still arrive here with dreams, doubts, and determination. Some stay, some leave, but almost everyone who passes through is changed in some way. The city continues to challenge, inspire, and demand resilience from those who call it home. And perhaps that is why New York still matters, not because it is the greatest city in the world, but because it is one of the most honest reflections of what cities and people truly are. Complex, flawed, restless, and always becoming.